Welcome to the Fleet Geeks podcast. We're here to help develop fleet and transport professionals. Do you want to progress and develop your skills and knowledge? We promise to bring lively conversation and debate around interesting issues and keep you bang up to date with changes in our awesome industry. The Fleet Geeks are a community of professionals, and if you enjoy the podcast, why not join the discussion for free in the Fleet Geek community over on Facebook.
So the red light is rolling, and it's fantastic to be joined today with Mr. Mike. Mike, how are we doing?
I'm doing fine, mate. Thank you very much. Very good.
Good. And we're joined again by Mr. James Adcroft. James, are you able to just introduce yourself for the listeners, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Mike. Hi, Pete. Thanks for inviting me to join you today. Again, my name's James Adcroft. I'm a transport compliance manager for a UK-based transport operator. Not that I'm here today on behalf of the people I work for, just here today to have a conversation with you about the topic of the day.
Appreciate that, yeah.
Very hot topic at the moment.
Yeah, very hot topic. So I'll sort of kick things off. We're going to be talking about the Driver CPC Consultation, and the podcast is going to form two parts. We're going to talk the first part now, and a bit later on you'll be able to listen to a part two where we're going to talk about returning drivers to commercial goods use.
I think there could be some sequels to this as well.
Yeah, I think there'll probably be some more in the future.
Yeah.
This episode very much comes with a caveat for me. In the show notes, there is a link to the consultation document online. Please do go and look at that. And there is also a webinar available around the DCPC. So we recommend that you go and review those two. I'm going to share a little bit of fact directly off the consultation website, which is going to lead us into having a conversation. But we're going to be avoiding discussing the facts, so to speak. It's more our interpretation or understanding of what we see. But please do take it as that. That is just our interpretation and speculation as our thoughts on the consultation. If you do want the facts of the consultation, please do follow the link in the show notes. Please do attend the webinar. This is a very complex consultation. It's a very complex thing, and if you rely solely on listening to the podcast, I don't think we're going to be able to cover every base in the time we've got the podcast. We're just going to have a look at some highlights and have a bit of discussion around that, and it's very much for raising, take this podcast as raising awareness, having some points of interest raised, a bit of entertainment hopefully, and you'll enjoy listening. But otherwise, if you want to see the facts, please do go and visit the website. Have you guys got anything to add to that? Is that sort of where we're at with things?
Yeah,
as well?
just before we start, consultations, being a former civil servant, God, sounds posh, doesn't it? Being a former civil servant, government, we have to, be very, very proud in this country of our government, and I say that with no tongue in cheek. The way this country is governed is incredibly democratic, and it's the most precious thing we hold, really, for as a society. Government consult, but the trouble is, people don't very rarely engage with that consultation. As a civil servant, it is not your views or opinions that are meant to be foisted upon the population. We rely on people bringing those views to us. What do you want? We govern for you. The civil service is in the service of the people. So if people don't engage with that part of the democratic process, nothing ever will change the way they hope or want it to. So please, I beg you to, rather than go on Facebook and just say Driver CPC should be scrapped, let's be positive, and if you have some views on it, whatever those views may be, some of that stuff may be valid, so please get onto the consultation and let people know your thoughts and views. But that's me. That's my party political broadcast on behalf of the civil service.
Thank you very much, James. What are your thoughts just before we get cracking and into the content?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. The way I'd give an introduction is the thing about Driver CPC, unlike some of the other topics that have been discussed on the podcast or that we deal with in our day-to-day lives in the industry, is that this is almost definitely going to affect everybody. Yeah, we've talked in the past about London issues, specific vehicle issues, international issues that might affect certain sectors. this topic is going to affect pretty much everybody. So everybody's going to have a view. It's going to be contentious with lots of discussion, and rightly so. And like Mike says, direct your discussion towards the consultation and have your voice heard. As you said in your introduction, Pete, it's there's a lot of detail there, so I think it'd be good we can headline some of the things that we can pick out from the consultation and have some interesting discussion around it. It's a big topic, and there's going to be a lot of discussion from a lot of people.
Absolutely, yeah.
The thing I would say, I'd love to start out by saying, if I can, draw a little line, which Mike touched on a moment ago. Let's draw a line very quickly. Driver CPC is not going to be scrapped.
No.
And I think that we see that a lot as a view on Facebook. We see that a lot
That's
when
not
we're
a
out and
consultation.
about. We hear that when we're out and about talking to people. I would urge people who want to assert that view, it's probably not going to add much value. Let's talk about how we can improve and what we can do. But if you're hanging your hat on Driver CPC being scrapped, then you're probably going to waste some of your energy.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a part of the consultation. I'm not going to lose my spot where I'm ready to talk from in a moment, but there is a spot. If you read the whole of the consultation, later on there is a background of Driver CPC, and there is a statistic shared in there which is 85% of all driver respondents said they had a better understanding of road safety off the back of Driver CPC. So therefore, the consultation is very much around amending the CPD element of it, not doing away with it. And that is part of the consultation a bit later on. Obviously, the link, like I say, is in the show notes, and you can have a scroll through and read of it yourself. But this is absolutely that. So I think it's quite exciting, and actually I think if the goal of this podcast is to actually get people to listen and go, do you know what, I'm going to voice my opinion on that consultation, I think that's a very worthwhile goal for this session, and that is, you know, the more diverse the opinion, the better the feedback. I think the better the result for everyone, or the majority of people, because ultimately there's going to be an outcome that some people aren't going to like, and like you say, it is contentious. So I'm going to kick things off. Looking at the link online, there's an initial executive summary. So the Driver CPC, DCPC as I'm going to refer to it just to save my tongue, is a qualification that professional drivers of certain goods or passenger carrying vehicles must hold in addition to their driving licence. It was introduced into domestic law as a result of EU legislation, and in the UK it is initially obtained by completing 4 tests consisting of a 2-part theory test, case studies, a practical driving test, a practical demonstration of vehicle operation. Drivers maintain the DCPC by completing 35 hours of periodic training every 5 years, and completing 35 hours of training allows a driver to drive for commercial purposes for 5 years. DCPC is currently required for drivers holding the following licence categories: C, CE, C1, C1E, D, DE, D1, D1E. This consultation seeks views on proposed changes to DCPC. These changes will only apply to driving journeys within Great Britain, extending to Northern Ireland, if authorities there agree. Drivers wishing to drive to, from or within the EU will still need to comply with the existing requirements. This is because they are contained within the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, or abbreviated to TCA, as well as other UK international obligations which the government cannot change unilaterally. The proposed changes will therefore create 2 parallel qualifications for driving in Great Britain and Northern Ireland: a national DCPC, which I'll refer to as NDCPC, which is the subject of this consultation, and an international DCPC, an IDCPC, the existing TCA compliant regime. That is the existing regime we have now. Both will permit driving journeys domestically, but only the IDCPC will permit driving to, from or within the EU. The proposed changes will only impact drivers who are maintaining their DCPC or regaining their DCPC for drivers who previously held one but let it lapse. And we're going to do 2 parts on this podcast. The first is around maintaining the DCPC, and we're going to do a second part about the regaining part. This is known as periodic renewal. These changes will look to, amongst other things, reform training, for example, by allowing shorter course modules, offer drivers the alternative of taking a test instead of completing training for maintaining or regaining the DCPC. changes will not affect how DCPC is initially obtained. So the initial obtaining of the DCPC is to remain unchanged. Okay, this is only for maintaining or regaining the DCPC or periodic renewal. The changes to establish the NDCPC will result in 2 further options for drivers: a reformed training route or a periodic test route. It is proposed that successful completion of either route would enable a driver to drive for 5 years. If both options of NDCPC are taken forward, it will mean drivers seeking to drive within GB and NI could have 3 ways to periodically renew their DCPC. And that's the end of the executive summary. The rest of it is sort of going into various objectives, and I encourage people to go and have a read and have a listen to those. But it's fairly complex stuff, guys, isn't it?
Yeah, I tell you, just before, I know James is going to have a look at the consultation and where we are with that. Just before, I know what a lot of people's hackles will be raised when they hear the word EU. And they'll say, well, this is European legislation. But I would cast people's minds back to the early part of the 2000s when we were going through another period of driver shortage. And it was actually the UK government, along with the Germans, who instigated DCPC in the very first place. And the objective of DCPC was to professionalise the industry. And it also allowed the EU to reduce the age at which a driver could acquire a vocational licence. So one of the conditions for holding a vocational licence at 18 is the initial driver CPC. So let's just not lose track of where driver CPC came from. It is not something that was foisted upon us by the EU. It was a joint response that was accepted by the EU and brought into legislation in order to combat an earlier driver shortage.
I've learned something there. That's quite interesting. That was interesting. Yeah.
2003.
I think that's a really nice way of actually framing the conversation today. So
yeah, sure. So and off the back of that, Mike, I would say that for those, and I'm not going to get political, but for those who are enthused by our separation from the EU and the opportunities that brings, this is what that is.
This is an opportunity.
So this is UK legislators being able to say we don't have to be bound by the rules in the EU. We can do something with this particular statute that's different in the UK. So perhaps some people are encouraged
as a result of
by that.
Brexit.
Yeah,
absolutely. And as I say, without getting political, this could be seen as a positive result of Brexit.
Absolutely.
So 100%.
So this consultation, arguably, we've been hoping, industry has been hoping to have a consultation on driver CPC for some time because reform is worthwhile. But I think it would be fair to say that what brought it to the forefront, as you've just mentioned, Mike, a couple of years ago, was when post-COVID driver shortage really put some tension on operators, and the government included the potential to review driver CPC in their list of items which would help encourage drivers back to the industry and help resolve driver shortage. So there was a consultation a couple of years ago, and now we have another one now where we're hoping where the DFT hope to make some firm decisions for us. I guess the other headline in terms of, again, what you two guys have just spoke about is inevitably, therefore, what we may end up with, if there's a change in the UK, what we're going to end up with is these two-tier system, where if you're an international operator, you will have no choice but to do what you're doing with your drivers. The drivers will have to follow the existing EU legislation covering driver CPC, which is what we're all familiar with. However, the opportunity may lie if you're a UK operator, because you could therefore take advantage of the changes that are being consulted upon. So let's headline a couple of things that we do know from the consultation to open up a discussion. And I'll refer just to the national driver CPC at the moment, not the international one that we touched on. So that's part of the consultation talks about having two strands to the change. One is about reforming the existing training. So do we look at reconsidering the course lengths, introducing more e-learning, having a practical element, so allowing more practical elements to the training rather than it being all classroom based. And then the other strand to the change talks about this new idea of periodic test. So the replacement of these classroom-based training courses with a periodic test. So let's add a bit of detail before we go into a discussion. In terms of the periodic test that's being consulted upon, the idea is that the DVSA will develop and deliver this test, approximately 50 questions lasting 1 to 1.5 hours. And the driver will have to complete that, and they'll have to pass that in order to maintain their driver qualification. And passing would give 5 years of the Driver CPC validity. Obviously, again, to keep stressing that in the UK only, GB only. And if the driver was unsuccessful in passing their test, the consultation proposes that there's a resit mechanism so that they can resit that. Or if they decide, actually, this isn't for me, they would have the option to go and go back and do classroom-based training, however that looks, and it may look a little bit different in the future.
Hello, it's Shani from Flagship Partners. We are really proud to sponsor the Fleet Geeks podcast. If you need expert advice or training for your fleet business, make Flagship Partners your first choice. We are really excited to announce the launch of our Transport Manager Academy. With expert development for fleet leaders, we offer fully accredited initial Transport Manager CPC training, CPC refresher, and operator license awareness training, as well as mentoring, support, and professional development beyond the qualification. Our vision is to develop elite fleet professionals.
In terms of the reformation of the classroom-based training, again, what's being consulted upon is the flexibility around it. So should it be this 7 hours rigid in a classroom with a high degree of scrutiny around how that rigidity around that is, which I know is a challenge to a lot of CPC trainers. So should we have different minimum training lengths, more split courses, all of that sort of thing. So introducing more flexibility is the principle.
Yes.
So there we go. A test and differencing in the way we do the training.
So
course.
I've got an interesting question which has arisen for me as part of this, and it diverts a little bit away, but hopefully I wonder if listeners might have thought the same question. So when you have an international operator's licence, the transport manager must have an international transport qualification, even if that operation doesn't actually utilise their international qualification. I will make an assumption, which I'm hoping for confirmation from you guys. I am assuming that this driver's CPC is only relevant to the driver themselves. So a national NCPC holder could still drive for an international operator, but wouldn't be able to drive abroad. Does that make does that question make sense?
Really good question.
Because I'm not sure if
I don't know the answer, but I would be inclined to agree because the point is that it's the driver that will have their license endorsed with that driver qualification.
Yeah.
Part of the consultation, without digressing too much, is that we go away from having a DQC and there's an annotation on the card like in Europe. And I think, and again, I don't know the answer, but I would be assuming the same as you, Pete. It's the driver that's qualified.
It's the driver that's qualified, but then...
So the driver could still work for any operator, but only within the UK. And it's just an interesting nuance that I don't know whether other people have
might
thought
be
of.
worth, again, as questioning, and I don't think we know the answer, but even if we're right and it's the driver, that's not to say that there couldn't be some impact on the operator, because we see that, don't we? So it's a good question, I don't know.
Yeah, I worked, I was a transport manager for many years for a company that held an international operator's licence, as many companies do. Even though I haven't got the numbers in front of me, but I'm fairly certain of the Senior Traffic Commissioner's report last year. The vast majority, or a majority, of operators hold international operators' licences. But if you compare that to the actual number of operators that go abroad, it's very small. Something like 8% of operators actually physically go abroad. A lot of people hold the licence. For the very, for no other reason other than it's exactly almost the criteria is exactly the same as a national operator's license. But that's interesting. So would a driver be able to work for I suppose I guess why we have a consultation. I'm
going to throw it out there initially. So let's address the most groundbreaking suggestion here is around the test.
Sure.
It's about there being a driver's test. So let's explore that pathway first, because ultimately, as James has just outlined, there are two suggested pathways which essentially both could come into play, which is a test followed by a resit if there's a failure, followed by or there could be a training option dependent. Obviously, in my experience, there are a lot of drivers, there are a lot of people out there in the world that really don't like tests, right? So and training would be a preference for them, and people will be listening and they'll have their own opinions on tests and whether that demonstrates knowledge, etc. I find the whole concept of a test for driving quite interesting as a whole.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm not too against it, which is quite strange because obviously we operate a training business.
Yeah.
So I do approach this from a slightly different
way,
angle,
yeah.
where this is really going to very much upset the business plan.
Yeah,
but at the same time, I recognise the challenges. But I think it's interesting that we're offering a potential test, and actually, that's something that goes beyond the internet and international DCPC. Sorry, I've got to get my language right. It goes beyond that because actually there is no test with the international DCPC. So essentially, someone can potentially sit for 7 hours and largely not engage, potentially English as a second language, potentially not understand a lot of the content, and go through a greater rigmarole. This is a demonstration of knowledge, which is, I think, a positive
Absolutely.
thing. I take that as a positive thing.
In theory, in principle, testing is probably long overdue in the driver CPC process. Even drivers, we have even drivers on saying, "Oh, what's the point in doing this? We don't even get tested." And there's when drivers are asking for something. But I like you, Pete. I've got mixed views on it. I think how do you ensure somebody has learnt if you're not testing them? What if you went out and did learnt to drive, but you didn't pass a driving test? It was, well, you've had some practice, it should be good enough. But the trouble is, a little bit like driving, you can actually be coached to pass a test. Is that knowledge, or is that simply learning the questions that are likely to be asked? And I know people do this now with the driving hazard perception, well, not the hazard perception, but the theory test. People learn the test and they just do practice, and they just learn in the questions and they're not learning the subject.
And sorry to interject because it's kind of your turn, James, but I'm just going to raise a point there actually, and I fully fundamentally agree with you, and I don't think my stepdaughter's going to be listening to the podcast, but I've got a real life example of that. My stepdaughter Shannon had done her practice tests online. I'm not convinced she'd even read the highway code. If that makes sense. But she's a smart girl.
And
she's a smart cookie. She has done multiple tests and she passed, I think, with one question incorrect on the theory test. So she passed with flying colours. But in reality, in real life, I've sat next to her in the car with the L plates on, and it's a very different story. So that does come with a health warning, and I think you've raised a very interesting point there, Mike. And that is that if we are to introduce a test, my input would be, or my request would be, that we have a very diverse set of questions, which are selected at random to a point where you couldn't pre-predict them, so to speak. I think you
can't learn them. You have to.
You need to understand the content to be able to answer them effectively. I think is probably my point. Sorry, James.
Yeah, no, I think the discussion is good. I would say that there are two schools of thought. So, whatever your view on Driver CPC, I think if you've been attending good courses with good trainers, there's no doubt that the Driver CPC has improved the professionalism and knowledge of our drivers on the road.
Absolutely.
If there's people who don't agree with that, then I'd even go as far to say, have you attended the right courses? Because I've seen some Driver CPC courses out there which are fantastic, and undoubtedly drivers leave that experience being more knowledgeable, more professional and more thoughtful, better roadcraft, safer driver. Absolutely. So the school of thought around the test is the potential for us to lose some of that value? Are there operators out there who, because it's commercially a better decision, and I'm not going to pass judgment on that, or because they're they just want to get drivers through as quickly as possible? A couple of possibilities there. But does that mean we could lose something in terms of that knowledge continuous professional development of our drivers. I think that's one school of thought. On the other hand, as I touched on, drivers, there are a lot of drivers out there who don't like, and aren't suited. It's not don't like, aren't suited naturally to those hours and hours in a classroom. And it might be that the reform of the classroom-based element gives us some better options for those drivers. So if we don't think, if an operator doesn't think a test is the way forward, actually, if we see some more flexibility on the classroom mechanism, that might suddenly become more attractive because, for example, instead of a driver sitting in a classroom for 35 hours or 5 sevens, we could say, well, actually, why don't you do 7 5s?
Yeah.
And those 5s could be a bit of practical, a bit of e-learning, I don't know what will fall out of the consultation, but if we see a real strong degree of flexibility in the classroom, then I think that might encourage some operators to say, actually, I'm going to retain the value and depth of knowledge by doing the quality training, as opposed to the test.
Yes.
There are a couple of schools of thought.
Yeah,
I'm not falling either way, but I think it's...
I've got fireworks going off in my brain at the minute because I've not really comprehended this before now. And it's quite interesting having the conversation because my mind's going all over the place. So my next question is as an industry, we're not the best at doing voluntary training. We do see, as an industry, and I'm generalising, I am generalising here, but generally speaking, as an industry, we do drive a CPC because we have to.
Without a shadow of a doubt.
So I think there will be a preference for many operators to go a test route, okay? Now, what's going to be very interesting, I just play that forward because I was thinking about a particular case where an operator we helped, the driver was using Google Maps on his phone and he hit a bridge, okay? It'll be very interesting to see where the burden of responsibility lies in the eyes of the traffic commissioner as to the decision-making process for that driver CPC against training when it comes to something, for example, like bridge strikes, where the requirement is that a driver will have done some training. I think I don't really know what my question is. Maybe it's just an observation, but I find that very interesting that a transport manager may at some point need to justify the training they're providing to their driver when there's been a preference to go for a test. So the driver's passed the test, but actually their driving standard has fallen below the expectations of us. And actually what potential repercussions there could be around the decision making in the business as to whether training or testing is the right route. I don't know the answer, and I guess I'm just speculating, but it was just where my head went, really.
I think you're right, and what it does do, it puts the onus back on the operator, doesn't it? Yeah. So instead of the operator being obliged to send their drivers on this on the training, and whether they choose great courses or choose perhaps some that could be a bit of a tick box, the operator would. Their obligations don't change, do they, in terms of their obligation to make sure drivers are suitably and sufficiently trained. Yeah. So if we see a change and an operator says, well, I'm going to go for the test for whatever reason, that operator would probably need to be mindful that you can't end driver development there. If you're going to go for the test, then an operator is going to have to be mindful that you still need to do ongoing training. That might mean things like bridge strikes, driver's hours. They're going to need to maintain that training. So I think it's the onus firmly sits on the operator.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the point, James, you've articulated that really well, actually, because I think where my mind sits with it is actually I believe there is a place for the test, but I also believe that I think that then gives an operator the opportunity for shorter, regular, bite-sized bits of driver development which potentially would suit the driver more. And what I mean is, let's have all the drivers in at 4 o'clock on Friday, let's get them home early. I'm thinking about a basic tipper operation or something like that does daytime work. Let's get the drivers in at 4 this Friday. We'll schedule in this year, let's do 6 toolbox talks every 2 months, have them in for 45 minutes to an hour. Where's the business at? Business update. These are the common infringements we've found. This is the toolbox talk that we're going to do for this session, and map out maybe 5 years worth of 6. All of a sudden, that's 30 bits of CPD, for example, over the same period. And actually, let's get the drivers to do the test. but actually let's make sure, because actually over that
We'll
time
back it up with
they've had 30 hours worth of demonstrable
Yeah.
training anyway, but just done it in shorter chunks which are much more achievable.
Yes.
That for me looks like utopia in my head. But yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Interesting.
I guess you would hope that good operators redirect the investment. So if there are operators, and there are lots of operators out there for whom CPC is a commercial investment as well, because they may pay their drivers to go, they may undertake the training themselves. I know that's not applicable to everybody, but where operators do that and they're therefore already investing in their drivers in that way, you would hope that a lot of those operators make a decision to maintain that investment. If they go for a test, well, actually, how can I maintain that investment in training? But as you say, perhaps do it more effectively in shorter chunks, more toolbox talks, more directed training in shorter sessions. Hopefully driver operators would retain that investment.
That is interesting. So sort of we've talked a bit about the test. What was the other part around the training? Because it was about rescheduling or reshaping the regularity and number of courses, for example. So my understanding was that it would still potentially be 35 hours, but it might be in shorter stints, for example, 5-hour modules, for example. Is that?
That's right. We're not going to go into all the detail on the podcast, but the headlines are that the proposals are around changing the minimum lengths of the modules. So it fundamentally is 7 hours, right? Or could it be 5, for example? Split course completion timings as well, e-learning. So introducing those...
A bit more flexibility. That's
exactly
what's
right.
missing at the moment.
Flexibility is the key. So that's the principles really around making it a bit more driver friendly.
And I think that would be a more, in terms of the driver engagement, I'm sure that would be a positive move. That would be a positive step towards driver engagement if they didn't have to sit there for 7 hours, which is it's a challenge for drivers, and it's a challenge for the training companies as well, and the trainers as well. It's a big investment, isn't it? But around the other proposals, then, what else have we got? What other stuff have we got to consider? I think
So the other interesting elements of the proposal, as Pete kicked off with, talks about changes to help returning drivers. One of the focuses of the consultation, as I said earlier, is about how can we improve the rate at which we can bring drivers back into the industry. So the other elements really are about that. I think
we'll lead on to that into the next episode. One of the things I've just scrolled through and found is one of the other changes, aside from changes to and I'm just reading this from the consultation document, other changes, aside from changes to the periodic renewal of the qualification, proposals have also been set out to allow the following: short-term time-limited extensions to existing driver CPCs in exceptional circumstances.
I wonder what they would be.
Sure. So I think where that comes from is COVID. So during the pandemic,
so it's kind of
one of the challenges we had during the pandemic is that because driver CPC is embedded in legislation, government couldn't easily say, we'll let you just carry on driving for a period of time even though your driver CPC is expired. That became very difficult. So I think that element is about embedding in legislation some flexibility. If we have some industry critical event, then we can it's already in the legislation that we can make an exemption for that, just like traffic commissioners can make driver's hours exemptions at the drop of a hat because they're given that power in the legislation. So I think we're making provision for that.
I think that sounds like a positive.
I don't think it would be something that would be used generally. Then I think the exceptional circumstances wouldn't be that Bob couldn't attend the last CPC course and now his card's run out, that wouldn't be exceptional.
Yeah,
And
that would be planning.
Cat died and he had the day off. Or something.
Exactly.
And I would hope not. It should be exceptions.
So just continuing in that vein, short-term time-limited exemptions from the need for a driver to hold a valid DCPC in exceptional circumstances. These would be for drivers whose DCPCs had expired recently. One interesting thing, there's a passage just towards the end of the document, I'll read from it, and I find this interesting. There are also quality improvements to periodic renewal, such as the continued development of suggested core content and refocus of training from prescriptive courses to outcome-based learning. That is, the use of more informal assessment in courses. These changes will be implemented and are not being consulted about within this document. Powers may also be taken. This is really interesting. Actually, it's sort of hidden towards the end of the thing. Powers may also be taken to change who is exempted permanently from DCPC, because there are some exemptions.
That would something that's been on the table for a long time, hasn't it?
But the department is not consulting in this document about specific proposals for this at this time. So that's a very interesting passage. And again, another recommendation as we start to close the podcast is to really read that document, because I've just come across that, and that's actually really interesting. So what they're saying is, what I'm understanding from that is they're not consulting on the quality improvements. That's going to be a given.
They're
going to be strict.
And that's really interesting, because I often think, in terms of transport manager training, I can make a judgment on somebody during the training. I can make a judgment on somebody, and my thoughts would be, having dealt with this person, having trained this person for the last 10 days, having asked many open questions, this person understands. And so that is, outcome-based training would be, that I, as the instructor, would in much in the same way as a driving test, really, isn't it? It's, I know that this person can do the job, and that would be interesting for Driver CPC, wouldn't it? Really, that's an interesting.
Yeah, so I think that's really applicable, and I think that's fantastic that there is really no need to consult on that, in that they're saying that is a demand, and that's absolutely, for me, the right way for things to go. Have you gents got anything to add? Otherwise, I'm just going to let people know, if you're listening, how to respond. The consultation period began on the 2nd of March. As we record this, we're quite a way into that, and at the stage of recording, we've got just over a month left to respond. So if you're listening to this, please do respond as soon as you can. Please ensure that your response reaches us before the closing date of the 27th of April. Electronic responses to this consultation would be preferred, either by responding to the online survey, so there's a link on the website I'm looking at, or you can email your response, and there are a list of questions for you to be able to do that.
And James, you might be able to answer this question. In response to these consultations, you respond as an individual, but I guess if you've got the authority, you can also respond as an organisation.
And I would hope that you would. I think you can respond as an individual, but organisations would want to respond, because the thing about an organisation is they will have some useful statistics and facts which will support their feedback.
That's interesting.
In terms of costs, in terms of benefits. Government are interested in hearing some of that detail, not just, I think this is a good idea, but this is the real impact on my business. This is whether it be positive or commercial or whatever it is.
So I think that objective evidence is invaluable.
That would be really that would be valuable for the consultation. So TMs out there, if have a word with the MD or the owners or whoever, and just say, look, we need to respond to this, and we need to respond to it as Fred Blogs Limited, not as me. So absolutely.
Fantastic. Is there anything else anyone wants to add? Otherwise, we'll see you on the next one around regaining the DCPC Part 2.
And I feel there could be Part 3 and 4 coming out, but there we go. Part 2.
Part 2 in the planning for now. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed it, and look forward to seeing you on the next one.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please share with your friends and colleagues too. Join us for free on Facebook with the Fleet Geeks community for transport and fleet managers. Fleet Geeks offers ongoing professional development, networking and mentoring too. So get in touch with me, Pete Rushmer, on any social media platform to find out more.